Nexus PMG welcomes you to the Bigger Than Us podcast, which we as energy geeks lovingly refer to as the BTU. Bigger Than Us is a podcast that focuses on ideas that will shape the future of our planet and ultimately our existence. We will occasionally lean into energy topics because, after all, it's the key to our collective survival. But we'll also explore other ideas and topics that we believe will have an impact that is bigger than us. And now, on to today's show. Hello, and welcome to the Bigger Than Us podcast. I'm your host, Raj Daniels, and today I'd like to welcome Andy Behar to the show. Andrew Behar is CEO of As You Sow, the nation's leading nonprofit practitioner of shareholder advocacy and engagement. Since 1992, As You Sow has used shareholder power to align investments with values and compel companies to reduce material risk on issues including climate change, toxins in the food system, ocean plastics, diversity, equity and inclusion, racial justice, and wage equity. Previously, Andrew was a documentary filmmaker and entrepreneur, founding startups, developing an innovative physiological monitoring medical device, and grid scale fuel cells. He is on the X Prize Brain Trust for Abundant Energy and the advisory boards of Real Impact Tracker and One Earth Institute. His book, The Shareholders Action Guide, Unleash Your Hidden Powers to Hold Corporations Accountable, was published in November 2016 by Barrett Kohler. Andy, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great. Thank you so much for inviting me.
Andy, thank you for joining us. Andy, where are you currently located?
In Berkeley, California.
How's the weather out there?
It's a lovely day today. I think we're in the 60s or high 60s, so very pleasant.
Well, I'm proud to say that today in Dallas we're at 67 and we're enjoying it a lot. It's very rare for us to be this cold this time of year. So I like to open the show by asking my guest the following question. If you were asked to share something interesting about yourself, what would it be?
I don't know. The work that I do at As You Sow is so interesting. It's the most interesting thing about me, I really believe. I got to say, it really is. It's just, I mean, I am so fascinated with all of the mechanisms, the machinations of the way corporate America works and the power that shareholders have, but don't realize they have. When I'm asked to do one of these icebreakers, and you write something on a piece of paper and they pass it around the room and somebody has to guess. The thing I generally put is that I appeared on stage at the Metropolitan Opera with Pavarotti. And so nobody can ever guess that. But I did, and in fact, do that. I was a spear carrier. Just totally randomly, a friend called and said, "We're short on spear carriers. What are you doing tonight?" And I lived in New York, and my cousin and I jumped on the subway, and we got there, and they put us out on stage, and there I was in Aida, carrying a spear at the Metropolitan Opera. But
I love that. That's beautiful. And since you mentioned As You Sow, can you give the audience an overview of As You Sow and your role at the organization?
Sure. So I'm the CEO of As You Sow, and by the way, it's spelled S-O-W, as you, S-O-W, as in the biblical, as you sow, so shall ye reap. And I've been the CEO for the past 11 years, so since 2010. It was founded in 1992. And so we've been around almost 30 years working on corporate accountability.
30 years is a long time, and we're in a different place today. Can you perhaps share maybe some ideas of how it's changed in the last 30 years from an awareness standpoint?
Well, when As You Sow started, it was doing a lot of work on litigating with big corporations that had carcinogens and reproductive toxicants in their consumer products. That was essentially what As You Sow was doing. So some of those cases settled, and so the settlement money came into As You Sow. And so we started realizing, well, we're interacting with all these corporations. Are there other ways to interact with a corporation? And one of the ways that we did was through direct engagement. So even back then, and by the way, there were faith-based groups doing this kind of thing back in the 1970s. Most famously, there were there were priests and nuns who showed up at the General Motors meeting to talk about South African apartheid. And as shareholders, they showed up, and the board and the executives at General Motors looked at them and said, what are you doing here? And they said, well, we own shares. And we object to the fact that General Motors is still doing business in South Africa. They have plants there, and that they are supporting the apartheid regime. And that was very famously the first time that I think shareholders were really heard in the power of shareholders. And what happened is they filed a shareholder resolution, and which is a formal way that a shareholder can address a corporation. And there's a vote, and they found that a lot of shareholders agreed. And this was a major shift. And so what we do is really just from that legacy, that standing on the shoulders of amazing people who have stood up to power in this way. And so we talked to a lot of companies. Last year in 2020, we had 131 engagements where we sat down with senior executives at many companies to talk about things like climate change, ocean plastics, toxins in the food system, racial justice, diversity, equity, inclusion, wage justice, a whole range of issues. Now, most of the companies, when we approach them, we say, look, we're shareholders, or we represent shareholders, and we've identified a material risk, and we have a solution that's going to make a better company, that's going to help the company avoid a potential litigation or a potential problem. And so when we present it in that way, it sometimes takes a little time, but eventually the company says, oh, this is actually a really good idea. We're going to benefit from this. And they adopt it. So we had 131 engagements last year. 55 of those, the company said, this is a great idea. Let's go do it. 76, we escalated by filing a shareholder resolution. And of those 76, all but 22 agreed to a settlement. 22 went to a vote, and we had 4 majority votes. And about $800 billion worth of shares were voted yes on As You Sow resolutions. Now, we're a small 501c3 nonprofit. We're 20 people, basically. And so we're leveraging our position as shareholders to really help these companies to find better environmental, social, and governance policies and practices.
So it's obvious you're punching above your weight. How many shares does an individual or your organization have to hold in order to get that engagement or get that audience?
So currently, you need to hold $2,000 worth of a company for 1 year in order to file a shareholder resolution. Now, last year, the SEC changed those rules, and they put new rules in place that will go into effect on January 1st of 2022 that make it much more. You have to hold $25,000 worth of shares. But there's a lot of, between now and then, we'll see if that ever actually gets instituted, because there's both a Congressional Review Act that's being looked at, and there's also potential litigation against it. So they're trying to make it more difficult for shareholders to have that engagement with the company. They're trying to make people with wealth have a louder voice. They're trying to suppress new ideas. This is all from the last administration's SEC, which tried to silence shareholders, and we will simply not be silenced. We own these companies. We are the beneficial owners of these corporations, and as shareholders, we have a right to make sure that the company avoids material risk. And that's why we own the shares. That's why people buy shares of stock, and that is absolutely a right that is that's not going to be taken away from them.
Going from 2,000 to 25,000 is quite a leap.
We think it is. We think it's not a good idea at all. So we wrote many comment letters to the SEC objecting to it, and I'm not getting into too much more of the nuance. There's actually 4 things that they're changing. One of them would not allow As You Sow to represent other shareholders. So currently, As You Sow, we represent shareholders. So, for instance, if we're going to be talking to Yum Brands about styrofoam, which this literally happened, where one of our programs has to do with ocean plastics and the destruction of the ocean ecosystem. So we had a conversation with Yum Brands, and we said, you guys use a lot of styrofoam, and most of it, or a lot of it's going into the ocean, and it breaks down into tiny particles, and the fish think it's food and they eat it, and it's destroying marine ecosystems. So from that engagement, we then found a shareholder, a person who'd held the stock $2,000 for a year. In this case, they held it for a decade and much more stock than that. They signed a document authorizing As You Sow to file on their behalf. And then we went and talked to the company. Now, the company said, well, we're not going to do anything. So we filed a shareholder resolution. We got a good vote. Now, by the way, these votes are all what are called precatory. That means that they are non-binding. Even if you get a 90% vote, the company doesn't have to do it. But if you get if you get a 20% vote, if one out of five of your shareholders wants you to do something, you're going to take a good look at it. So Yum Brands, after much negotiation, agreed to stop using styrofoam in 6,700 stores across the entire planet. Similarly with McDonald's, similarly with Dunkin', if you combine them all together, about 3 billion styrofoam cups will not be produced this year because of 3 engagements that As You Sow had with these 3 companies that suggested they could be using recycled cardboard and that they could also recycle that cardboard and they could be part of a circular economy and it would be good for their brands. It would cost them less, etc. So that's kind of how it works, is just in one kind of a simplified example.
That's pretty amazing change you made there. What's some of the pushback besides? I'm going to state the obvious. Maybe is saving money or not wanting to spend additional money for recycled materials. What's some of the pushback you get from some of these companies?
A lot of times they're just not that aware that this risk exists. So another example would be we saw this risk around what are called superbugs. So when you feed chickens, poultry, antibiotics in their feeds, they're getting it every single day. What happens is that the bacteria evolves. They become superbugs. They're antibiotic resistant. So we approached the big poultry producers, Tyson and Purdue and Sanderson Farms, and we talked to them about it. And they said, well, we're just not interested in this. They basically told us take a hike. So we did. We took a hike down to their customers and we talked to McDonald's, who we have relationships with, Wendy's, KFC. They were not that interested. So we took another hike and we started talking to parent groups. There were groups that had organized saying that they did not want their kids exposed to superbugs, and so they weren't going to be allowing them to eat chicken McNuggets anymore. So we met with them. We helped them amplify their message a bit, and we took that back upstream. We said, McDonald's, we have a McNugget crisis here. Now, they didn't see it coming. It wasn't on their radar. We said, but we see a material risk. It's going to impact our market share. Well, once you start talking about market share, they get very interested. And they said, wow, what do we do? They said, well, you tell your suppliers that you want chicken that's raised without medically important antibiotics. So they signed the pledge. We took that to Wendy's. They said, McDonald's is doing it? Okay, we'll sign. Took it to KFC. They signed, took all those signatures upstream to the same group, Tyson, Purdue, and Sanderson, and said, look, all of your customers are saying they want a different product. If you don't supply it, you're not going to be in business. They all said, okay, and they all changed. So the whole industry just wasn't acknowledging that there was a scientifically known problem that was going to affect market share and ultimately affect public health. And so we brought that information to them. And once they understood the impact that it would have on them, they agreed that there was a sensible solution. So that's an example of how you use market forces to help to inform these corporations, really.
Well, market forces and peer pressure, I guess, too.
Yeah, I'd say that's peer pressure is a very powerful thing. When one company, now we do this a lot where we do scorecards. So I mentioned ocean plastics. Right now we're working on a second report. It's actually our 6th report on ocean plastics, but 2 years ago we did one where we looked at 50 companies on 35 key performance indicators on plastic. And we're now redoing it to see how the companies have improved. We also looked at 14 food companies on their pesticide use. Did they spray their food with glyphosate, which is a known carcinogen? And in this case, basically every food company in America, every major one, was spraying what's Roundup, which is a known carcinogen. It's also known as glyphosate. That's the chemical term. They spray it on their wheat, oats, and beans right before they harvest it. And this is to desiccate it. It's called a desiccant. What it does is it basically, if you're going to go in with a thresher on a wheat field, some of the wheat's a little greener, some of it's browner. You want it all evenly brown so you get the highest yield. So they spray it with this toxic poison a week or two before harvest, and then it increases the yield. But it also puts a carcinogen in all of our food, in all of our wheat, all of our beans, all of our oats. And so we talked to Kellogg, and we said, hey, the folks at Kellogg, we sent them a letter. We usually send a letter first. We said, we think there's a real problem here having to do with, putting toxic material into your food products. And we believe Kellogg food should be safe to eat. So we came in, we had a meeting with them, and we explained to them the risk. Now, when we presented it and we're saying, we think it's just bad business to be poisoning your customers. And they're looking at us and going like, how so? And we're saying, well, because there have been 2 cases at that time on glyphosate. Now, these were cases where somebody was spritzing glyphosate in their backyard for, to knock down the weeds, that had gotten a $200 million and a $400 million settlement. We said, imagine every single bowl of Special K has glyphosate in it. This is going to be bigger than tobacco settlements because people are eating it, and they're eating it every day. And then they went, oh, okay, this is real risk. And we said, yes. And they said, we agree. Kellogg signed a no glyphosate policy. They're moving it through their entire supply chain. It's going to take them a few years, but they are going to drive this practice. Now, nobody was spraying glyphosate 10 years ago. Everybody was harvesting their food. In fact, they don't do it anywhere else in the world. Europe banned it years ago because, of course, they have what's called the precautionary principle, where you have to prove something safe before you put it in your food. In the United States, you can put anything in your food, and then you have to prove that somebody got sick from it and prove the causation, which is nearly impossible. So we just have it upside down here in the United States. But Kellogg agreed. They said, yeah, we're going to do this. And now you mentioned peer pressure. So now we've brought that to all the other food companies and said, look, Kellogg's is doing it. Kellogg's food is safe to eat. Don't you want yours to be safe to eat? And they're all saying, yeah. And we're explaining to them that they don't have to buy these expensive chemicals. They don't have to hire these airplanes to spray it on the crops, that they can harvest it. And they'll have it's like a 3% lower yield, which actually they'll actually make more money because the cost of doing all of that mechanized toxic farming costs more than what they were making from the gain of it. We have a system that just oftentimes does not make sense, just in terms of if you just think about it in the most basic common sense way, that these farmers didn't want to spray their crops, but they felt they had to, and they were pressured by Monsanto and other big corporations to do it. So Kellogg is a leader. We got them. Now we're getting all of their competitors to follow them. And soon we will have a glyphosate-free food system in the United States.
Well, I appreciate you for doing that, especially with 3 young kids who happen to love Kellogg cereals.
They're good. They're going to be safe to eat soon.
Absolutely. How do you get access to the data from the companies regarding, what they're doing?
Well, first of all, anything that we have in our scorecards is something that is publicly disclosed, which means that it is a material disclosure by the company, which means the company must be truthful or they risk a material breach. So another example of a scorecard, after the George Floyd murder last summer, we created a racial justice initiative. And we started looking and saying, well, how do we evaluate one company versus the other? And we realized there's no data. So we hired a woman. Her name is Olivia Knight. She'd written her master's thesis about environmental justice. And she put together a team, and we started gathering data on the S&P 500 on racial justice. So we brought together an incredible advisory council, people with real deep expertise on this issue. And we just developed 22 key performance indicators. And we had our researchers go out and read the CSR, the corporate social responsibility reports, the annual reports, what's on the website of these companies, read the news from the companies to see how they fit into these key performance indicators. And what it did is we came up with an aggregated score for the company. And we then could look across the S&P 500. And if you go to our website, if you go to asyousow.org, right on the right on the front page, click on the Today Show. Today Show did a 5-minute piece, video on the racial justice scorecard. So you click right there, you'll get to see the video, but it'll also take you to a page where you can click on a data visualization tool where you can search any company and you can compare it to any other company. And you can slice it by sector. Now, we also did this for diversity, equity, and inclusion. What we found is that there was so little data that was out there that we started just to grade the companies on, did they disclose data? Did they disclose their EEO1, which is their Equal Employment Opportunity Form, which every company does, but only some companies disclose. So were they disclosing that? But that's not even a great metric. So we wanted much deeper data. So we started asking the companies for data on recruitment, retention, and promotion, cut by gender, cut by race, cut by ethnicity. Because then you could see if a company hires a lot of people of color, but they never promote them and they don't pay them well, you don't see that in the EEO1. We want to see that. We want to see the pay gap for women. There's a promotion gap for women that I'm not sure if you know this, but most people talk about that women get paid less than men for doing the same job, and that is true. But an equally problematic data point is that if 50% men and 50% women start at an entry level, when you get to a senior vice president level, then you have 18% women and 82% men. The women are not getting promoted. And so that shows up in the data we're looking for. You wouldn't spot that looking at an EEO1. So in any case, we now have a scorecard for the S&P 500 looking at diversity, equity, and inclusion disclosure. And we have one for racial justice. We're about to expand racial justice to incorporate 5 new key performance indicators on environmental justice. And then we're going to expand the whole thing out to the Russell 1000. So we're going to add another 500 companies later this year. And in this way, it gives companies a way to benchmark themselves also. So this is really important for companies to see that how they're being scored, how they're being evaluated, how they're being seen by the world. And it also, customers, it will change their loyalty. If they see a company that they're really loyal to getting really bad grades on racial justice, well, they might just shift over to one that has a better score. And that drives the company to then improve their policies and practices. One company that got a very poor score was Abbott Labs. It's a major pharmaceutical company. And we actually engaged them in a conversation about what they should change. But they decided they didn't want to implement the changes we had in mind, which were incremental over time. And so we went to a vote, and we just got a 40% vote. So almost half of Abbott's shareholders believe that racial justice is a really important thing for the company to work on. And just this morning, we actually got a majority vote at American Express on diversity, equity, and inclusion. So what you're seeing is that shareholders are sending a very strong message to management and the boards that these are important material issues that they must really deal with in a very sincere way. And it's not a mystery of what they need to do. We know what they need to do. We know what best practices look like. And it has to do with justice. It has to do with basic justice and transparency. So this is not rocket science for these companies to fix this issue and therefore get better scores. This is just a matter of internally for the company deciding that this is something that is of importance.
I was going to ask you, and maybe you could give an example of a company, you mentioned Abbott, that has challenged the metrics that you've chosen for your scorecard and pushed back and said, we disagree with you.
No, Abbott didn't disagree, actually. Abbott actually said, you're right. Our CEO didn't sign a racial justice statement, and we didn't call for a change for systemic racism. And we don't disclose all of our diversity, equity, and inclusion information. No, they agreed with us, and they agreed that the metrics that we were looking at were important. Well, the feedback we did get was that some of the companies that came out in the top 10, they have their business model is not necessarily beneficial to communities of color. And therefore, that's why we added the 5 new key performance indicators that more evaluate the overall, what does the company do for a living? And is that, should they be in the top 10, regardless of how well they address their racial justice issues within the company? Their very business itself is problematic. So that's something that we're looking at really closely. Again, we brought our advisory committee together to talk about it and figure it out, to look at past studies, who's done work, trying to do it in as thoughtful a way and as transparent a way as possible. All of our methodologies are clearly put out on our website, and we welcome any kind of somebody who says, hey, you could have done this better. That's how we get better. We have a whole other set of data that evaluates mutual funds that has evolved. We started in 2015, and the idea was most people own mutual funds. There's 100 million people who work at companies that have a 401k plan or a 403b plan if you work at a college or a nonprofit. No one knows what they own. No one knows what's actually inside a mutual fund. Now, mutual funds are a basket of stocks. It could be 500 stocks. It could be 1,000. It could be 3,000 stocks. It could be 50. If you read the prospectus, it'll tell you how many, but they'll only ever talk about the top 10 holdings. That means the companies that have the greatest proportion of money associated with them. But you could be owning all kinds of companies. And so we were involved with, there was a whole movement around divesting fossil fuels. And again, we don't work alone. We coordinate with a lot of other groups. And in any case, there was a statement: I want to divest from fossil fuels. I don't want to own big oil. I don't want to be part of climate change. I don't want to be destroying the planet. And about 50,000 people signed this pledge. And what we discovered when we talked to them is nobody knew what they own. They said, what do I do now? I don't even know if I own anything. So, and there was no way to find out. So what we did is we built a tool. It's called Fossil Free Funds. If you go to fossilfreefunds.org, there's just an entry bar. You could type in Vanguard, or you can type in VINIX, which is a ticker, or you can, whatever, you can just write the name of the fund. And what pops up is an analysis. So this particular Vanguard fund, it has 22 companies that are big oil companies. It has this many 18 coal companies. It's got 16 fossil-fired utilities. Now, you might think this fund, because it's called something, the Vanguard, the Admiral Fund. Oh, it's about admirals, of course. It must be good. But in fact, you own all these fossil fuel companies. So then we went deeper, and we partnered with the Friends of the Earth. And we started looking at that same basket of stocks from the lens of deforestation. Well, click on the deforestation score right there, and it'll take you over to the deforestation site. And you will see that you own companies that are burning down the Indonesian and the Amazon rainforest. You'll see that you own big banks that are funding their destruction. And you'll see the consumer brands that use palm oil, that use paper, rubber, timber, cattle, and soy, that are creating demand to continue to destroy the rainforest. So then we go deeper, and we started looking at weapons. And we looked at, are you benefiting, are you profiting from cluster munitions, landmines, nuclear weapons, assault weapons? When there was that Walmart shooting, the site was just so overwhelmed with people wanting to know, am I profiting from assault weapons? And then you find when you go and I do a lot of talks at different organizations about their 401k plans and about how they invest and aligning investing with values. An example, I was at the World Bank, and they gave me a list of what's in their 401k plan. And I start just bringing these up and just to show people what's inside. And there it was, just you couldn't miss it, that they got an F because they were invested in cluster munitions and landmines. Now, a lot of the people in the audience have spent their entire career trying to eradicate cluster munitions and landmines, and they were horrified. And there was no way for them to know it. But here it was. And all we're doing is we're just comparing databases. And we update it once a month. We make sure it's always present and always as up to date as possible. And it's really just about transparency. We're not telling people how to invest. What we're saying is just invest with intention. If So we then added a gender equality funds one, and then most recently this summer, as part of our racial justice work, we added private prisons. And I can tell you that if you own Vanguard, if you are in a Vanguard fund, you are profiting from private prisons. You are profiting from the prison industrial complex. And that's just the way Vanguard invests. All of their top funds get D's and F's on our site because they own actual private prisons and also other companies that support the prison industrial complex. So the manifestation of racist policy, which is the incarceration system in the United States, you are making money from if you invest at Vanguard. It's just the way it is. I could keep going here. BlackRock just put out a new fund called the U.S. Carbon Transition Readiness Fund. So people thought, oh, well, this will reduce my climate risk. And $1.2 billion invested in this fund the first day. That's a record. That is the most money ever flowing into an ETF, that's an exchange traded fund, in one day. 1.25 billion. And I'm sure most of those people went there because thought they were getting climate risk. But if you do the analysis, the Exxon, Chevron, Duke, Southern, all the big utilities, all the coal-fired utilities, Schlumberger, all the oil field services, the pipeline companies, the big banks, JP Morgan that funds all the destructive projects. It's basically, I would have called it the carbon business as usual fund. And I don't think they would have gotten as much investment had they named it in a more appropriate way. So I find the naming misleading, but the SEC allows it. So this is the nature of investing today. You have to do your homework because there are fossil-free funds. They're literally called fossil-free funds with 27 fossil fuel companies in them. It's just, you have to do your homework. It's like, you got to read the label, to know what's inside.
So, Andy, I'm busy. I have a family, work, kids, just life in general. This is an automatic set it and forget it kind of ETF, perhaps. Where can I go, or is there an easier way for me to find out where I can do responsible, sustainable investing?
The tools we built are pretty easy. You will know where you're at in under 3 to 5 minutes. If you look at your 401k and write down the ticker numbers, as you're probably invested in maybe 4 or 5 different mutual funds. If you go to our site, just type them in and you'll see it's a report card, and you can see your grades across all 7 different issue areas. So you'll know pretty quick.
What's the alternative? Where can I invest my money responsibly?
Okay.
What kind of effort do I have to go through to go invest responsibly?
You may find in your 401k plan, some 401k plans have 20, 50, 80 different choices. You may find that there's another choice that might have, I've seen funds where, plans, 401k plans, where people were invested in one fund that had 300 tons of carbon per million US, like the number 300, remember that in terms of carbon. And there was another fund that was pretty equivalent that had 20. So they could reduce their carbon footprint massively just with one click, but they just didn't know that. A lot of funds, though, are invested. There's nothing that's sustainable in them at all, which means it's going to be more problematic in terms of you're going to need to talk to your 401k administrator and say, there's nothing I can invest in. I need you to add a fossil-free, a weapon-free, a gender-positive fund, a prison-free. And frankly, every mutual fund manager should just add, we believe, at least 20% of the holding of the funds in the plan should offer some alternatives to people. And they should vet them the way they vet any other fund, looking at their returns over 5 or 10 years or 3 years, whatever they require. They should be looking at, some funds say, you can't have a fund in here that's got less than $2 billion in assets. We understand that. There are so many good funds. When you go to our site and you click on Show Me the Best Ones, you see funds that get all A's or all B's or B and better. And there are just literally hundreds and hundreds of these. There is a whole industry of people, of really brilliant investment professionals that have spent their whole careers figuring out how to do this right. And many of them belong to an organization called USIF, SIF, Social Investing Forum. If somebody's a member of USIF, pretty good chance they've actually got the real McCoy. They've actually got real funds that have environmental, social, and governance. And when you compare them, you've got to do your own comparison and decide on returns, on fees, on whether you want something that's an ETF or managed. And I know this is getting more complex, but there's a certain amount of responsibility. It's your money, and if you just put it into the default option that your company gives you, and you feel good about profiting from private prisons and from burning down the Amazon, then that's your personal decision. But I don't think many people actually have thought that through. And it's not that difficult. It really is not. They will make it seem like it's very, very difficult. And when you go and talk to your 401k administrator, and by the way, on our site, on Fossil Free Funds, if you click on the toolkit, we have a letter you can download, and you can fill in your company name to bring to your 401k administrator that explains all this stuff. We have a toolkit, and we have videos, and step 1, 2, 3, how you do it, how you talk to your peers about this. We are going to be coming out with, and this should probably help, a report card for every company. So, for example, Amazon, they are great on climate change. What can I say? They're in the middle of buying 100,000 electric vehicles. Their data centers will all be powered by renewables. Operationally, A+. But every single person who works at Amazon owns the destruction of the Amazon. That's right. Every single fund that Amazon has gets a very poor grade for rainforest destruction, and not to mention big fossil fuels and private prisons and all that. But the irony is not lost on me. Or should it be on anyone who works at Amazon? And frankly, Jeff Bezos, if he just said, you know what, fix this, it would be fixed in if it takes more than a month, then you got the wrong advisor. You should get a new financial advisor. This is not rocket science. This is just, you can add to a plan. You could add 20 more funds to the plan. Do your due diligence and add them, and then train people and teach them what it is. This is the thing. At Amazon, they actually do have a, quote, sustainable fund, but only 1.88% of the money in the plan is being put in that sustainable fund. And by the way, it's not a great fund. It's a Vanguard fund, and it does really poorly on private prisons and really poorly on rainforest destruction. But it's at least named a sustainable fund. But just one more note about naming. In the 3,000 funds that we evaluate, 88 have ESG, environmental, social, and governance, in their name. That's the name of the fund. And of those, half of them, literally 43 of them, get a D or an F on one of our metrics. These are funds with ESG in their name. So buyer beware. It is not laid out for you easily. The SEC is not doing a very good job about actually making things so that they're not misleading.
Well, for those of you listening, I would highly recommend, I'm on the site right now, the Invest in Your Values tab. You could spend an entire morning there going through your funds and the reports. I think it's an extremely robust site, and I really appreciate the work you've been doing. You mentioned something about personal decisions earlier, and earlier in the conversation, you said you've been with the organization, I believe, 11 years. What's your why? Why did you come to the organization, and what keeps you going? You mentioned earlier, too, about your work is very interesting, and I appreciate that. But, what's your personal underlying motivations?
I've always felt that corporate power was something that was outsized. Of the 100 largest financial entities in the world, 69 are corporations. So Walmart sits right between Canada and Spain. These are the largest, most powerful entities on the planet, and they control our lives. That if you look out and you say, I don't like climate change, I don't like what's happening to the oceans, racial injustice, like this current paradigm that we're in is not what I would consider to be sustainable. It can't be self-sustaining, nor is it taking care of people. Well, that's because of corporate policies and practices. And so I've always felt that by shifting those practices, that can be beneficial to the company and to, you hear people talk about, the triple bottom line, people, planet. Um, it's there's a path to a regenerative economy based on justice and sustainability. I believe that. I see it. I'm seeing it happen. I'm seeing it emerge right now, every day. Companies that are showing their leadership are the ones who need signals from their investors and from their customers to say, yes, keep leading. And there's this whole other paradigm based on destruction and extraction that's no longer, it's dying away. The ideas of Milton Friedman have been overturned. There's a whole new philosophy. There's a new purpose of a corporation that the Business Roundtable and the World Economic Forum have endorsed that talks about this, that gives companies permission. They've all signed up for this to take care of their employees, to take care of their communities, their supply chain, their customers, and their shareholders. That this is the emergence of a whole new, just a whole new paradigm. And that to me is what keeps me going, because I see it clearly. I see that it's not only possible, but it is beneficial for everybody. And so it's a matter of kind of we're midwives for this new economy, and the birth pangs are painful, and we're in the middle of it right now. So this is the moment, and this is the moment for people to become aware of your power as you emerge from your COVID isolation. We've all been, in our little cocoons, and in our cocoons we have transformed, we've metamorphosized, and we now realize how powerful we are. We own all these companies. And if, as shareholders, we get together and say, we own this company and we want it to act in a different way, then that will be what happens. And so this is a moment in time to really look at your power, and don't abdicate your power. That's what's been going on for too long. And we can actually really have a completely changed world.
So we're 50 years into, I guess, 50 years-ish, the years after Milton Friedman and his famous letter that he wrote in the paper regarding shareholder primacy. How long do you think it will take us to unwind it?
Well, it took 50 years to win the battle of ideas. It took 50 years for shareholder advocates. And I mentioned the nuns, the faith-based groups that were at the General Motors meeting in 1970s. Though what they were asking for was stakeholder capitalism. So it took 50 years for the idea to shift. I think we can actually change the rest of it now to follow. I'd give it within the next 3 to 5 years. I think the companies that don't do this will be out of business. I think they'll be winding down. I think most of these big oil companies that don't transform will be winding down. I think you're going to see, people kiddingly call it Exxon Kodak. Well, there's a reason for that, because they're just, a decade of losing money. They don't seem to realize that all those European oil companies are actually transforming. Look at the Danish natural gas company that's become Ørsted. That's now the world's largest offshore wind company. You can power the whole planet with offshore wind. I mean, there's so many opportunities, and yet there's all these companies that just keep sticking their head in the ground. They will not be in existence. Coal, everybody said, coal would be, coal industry's lost 80, 90% of its value. It's just, we're in a transformation. And so we're going to be seeing a lot of companies winding down in the next few years. And we're going to see a lot of companies that are willing to actually be bold leaders will actually be taking the forefront. And so this is an amazing time. This is a remarkable time to be alive and to help midwife this new era, this new, as the World Economic Forum. Now, you wouldn't think I'd be quoting the World Economic Forum, but they put forth a manifesto, the fourth manifesto for the fourth era of business. I mean, that's what you're hearing from the World Economic Forum. Those aren't my words. And what they're talking about literally is adoption of stakeholder capitalism, where you take care of of your employees and your customers and your community. You don't dump in the commons. You don't externalize your costs. That they always come back to bite you. That you think long term. And this is where we are in the middle of. And there's corporate executives and corporate boards that are thinking about this right now. And this year, the proxy votes are going to be off the charts. I've already seen more majority votes than I've ever seen. And there's a reason. It's because shareholders are waking up and they're saying, I don't want my company that I own to do this anymore. And we own them. So we're the boss.
So, in my research for this conversation, I watched a TEDx talk you gave back in, I believe, 2010. So, 10 years ago now. You've been with the company 11 years, you've said. What's the most valuable lessons you've learned about yourself on your journey?
Tenacity, that if I just stay true to the North Star of empowering shareholders to own their power, that they'll come around. That when I started, people were kind of looking at me and going like, yeah, come on. When we put out the first investor value tool, fossil-free funds, people were saying, well, this is interesting. But I mean, we couldn't get any funding for this. I mean, literally, 6 months I talked to foundations about the importance of data, that is transformational. And now people are coming around to it. So it's really just pure tenacity of believing in these ideas, believing in these ideals, and doing the work, doing the hard work in the weeds, looking at the real data, making sure it's accurate, making sure our methodologies are absolutely transparent, listening. So it's really about tenacity and knowing that ultimately this is about truth. This is about truth and about power, and that people want to have a world that is regenerative, that is sustainable, and that takes care of people. So it's our vision is a safe, just, and sustainable world for all. So a safe world, a just world, a sustainable world for everybody. That's our North Star, and so that's it.
So, speaking of believing in your ideals, it's fast forward, it's 2030. If Forbes or Business Week were to write a headline about As You Sow, what would it read?
It would read shareholder power. I think that's about it. because here's the interesting thing. You look at and people say, "Oh, these boards of directors, they're inaccessible." No, they work for us. Like every board of directors and every CEO works for the shareholders. We are the boss. So it's just a matter of us realizing that we have the power and then voting. Most people don't even vote. 30%. I mean, 30% of votes are basically retail, and only about 18% even vote. We just actually created a new voting service called As You Vote. It sits on the Proxy Edge, the Broadridge Proxy Edge platform. And we want everybody to vote. And we're going to make it so simple. We're going to make it one click, and everybody will vote. And everyone's going to vote and say, yeah, I don't want this company to be destroying my environment. I don't want my company to be abusing their employees. It's like, I don't want slavery in supply chain. And you'll be able to vote. And it's really about exerting our power. So I think we're going to see a lot of new boards of directors. I think you're going to see all kinds of new rules around auditing, because right now there's not a lot of transparency. Companies need to be absolutely transparent with all their environmental, social, and governance disclosures. We got companies saying one thing out of one side of their mouth, and then they're saying, oh, yeah, we're going to work on climate change, and then on the other side they're funding dark money groups to go and try to destroy any kind of policy or any kind of change on climate. You've got this duplicity, and the more we call them out on it, the more we say this cannot, and these people just should lose their jobs. I mean, that is what's called, that's lying. That's not something that we want in our corporate cultures. So just like get it straight and do it, say who you are, and that's it's not, this is not I've said this many times now in this interview. It's not rocket science. This is like simple common sense. You don't need a PhD in economics to know that you don't lie to your shareholders. But yet a lot of companies, they say one thing and they do another. And we've been asking that question of BlackRock a lot lately. At last year's AGM, literally, I asked directly, if you can see the videotape of my talk there, which is how do words become actions? That Larry Fink's letter points out the problems, but then they have the solutions in their grasp, and they don't do it. And this is one thing that just is a real big question in my mind. Like Larry Fink and people like Jamie Dimon, they've amassed power over their lives, and they've identified the problems. Like Larry Fink's letter brilliantly talks about every company must have a Paris-compliant transition plan. Yet he stops short of saying, and if you don't, we're going to vote against your board. And if you don't, after 6 months after that, we're going to drop your company from our managed funds. If he said that, every company would have a climate transition plan. If Jamie Dimon said, JP Morgan will no longer invest in any extraction projects, it's going to change the nature of the cost of capital to do an extraction project. It's going to go through the roof. And so this is the ability of these, I'm picking up just these two. If they just did those two things tomorrow, it would change the nature of the battle to save the planet from climate catastrophe. And yet they don't. And if they did, they would make more money. Their brands would be through the roof. People would be saying, oh my gosh, BlackRock, they're using their power. BlackRock just voting for a climate resolution they basically voted against every climate resolution for the last 10 years. They're starting to just now begin to vote because of pressure there's like 10 different NGO groups that are pressuring them and pointing out how they say one thing and do another. So we have the capacity to actually fix these problems, but our leaders are choosing not to. And I don't understand why, because they could be on the front, they could be on the cover of Time magazine as like world heroes. They probably win Nobel Prizes and make more money. Mm-hmm. And yet they decide, I could be Batman, but I'm going to be Penguin. I don't get it. If I could be Batman, I'd be Batman. I wouldn't be Penguin.
Well, I love the idea of the headline, shareholder power. Hopefully it'll come out sooner than later.
Yeah.
And you've already given some very tactical advice, but if you could narrow it down, let's say someone's listening today, what's one or two things they can do professionally or personally, words of advice, words of wisdom, what would it be?
Know what you own, understand your own power, align your investing with your values, and you just use your power. Just exert what is yours. Don't abdicate your power.
Andy, I think that's a great place to end. Don't abdicate your power. I know I'm going to be on your site for quite a bit. I'm going to see if I can download the letter and send it off to our 401k provider and see what changes we can make personally. I've really enjoyed speaking with you, and I'm again highly recommend the audience to go to your site and check out all the tools and the reports. You'll spend an entire day there. The information is amazing. Thank you so much for your time. Is there anything else you'd like to share before we go?
No, thank you. I really appreciate your time, and I really just great appreciation for what you do, and just because spreading the word is so important. The communication around it is critically important. A lot of people just don't even know that this whole world exists, and so just putting it out there and spreading the word is just hugely important. And I guess I can't end without saying we are a 501c3 organization. We run on a shoestring of a budget, and we appreciate any donations from anyone. We have huge gratitude for the foundations who support us, and also for our individual donors.
I appreciate it. And speaking of spreading the word, I do want to give a quick shout out to Glenn Hallam of Green Wave, where I learned about you when you presented there. It was a phenomenal conference, and if it wasn't for him, I wouldn't have heard about you. So thank you, Glenn.
Thank you, Glenn. Agreed.
Appreciate
All right,
it.
you be well. Thank you.
You too.
Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening. If you like our show, please give us a rating and review on iTunes. And you can show your support by sharing our show with a friend or reach out to us on social media, where you'll find us under our Nexus PMG handle. If there's a subject or topic you'd like to hear about, send me an email. btu@nexuspmg.com or contact me via our website, nexuspmg.com. And while you're there, you can sign up for our monthly newsletter where we share what we're reading and thinking about in the clean tech, green tech sectors. Bigger Than Us is a Nexus PMG production.